Hello, everyone. So, we're going to be continuing with the discussion on Hadith source criticism as well as Hadith preservation. And in this episode, what we will be doing is we'll be hitting on kind of the reliability of the historical record found within the Hadith. And this one is specifically to do with the military and political narratives. Again, a lot of these arguments were compiled and written out by an individual named Ammar Adil, and I'll be posting his book in the description below. And a lot of these arguments also come from an individual named Ross Rodgers, and it's a primary source material. He has a book called The Generalship of Muhammad, and a lot of these are also found there. So make sure you check those particular books out. So an overview of the presentation, we'll be going over the reliability of the historical records, specifically with regards to the military perspectives. And the next portion will be going over kind of the political motives and the logistics involved. We're going to be going over certain praises of individuals that we're not expected or we don't expect to find had the hadith been forged. So we'll spend some time talking about that as well. And then lastly, we're going to be talking about stories found within the hadith corpus that kind of seem to embarrass Muslims. And again, that goes to show that if hadith were in fact preserved, we wouldn't be find, or if hadith were fabricated, we shouldn't find those kind of stories in the hadith corpus. So just before we begin, many of you guys probably already know this, but you have the Orientalist view, which is dichotomized into an earlier Orientalist view and a later Oriental view. And I essentially what they argue is that the hadith are pretty much wholesale late forgeries. And so hadith are shaped and motivated by political circumstances and political factionalism. And so the idea here is that the hadith that we have today are the result of these like minute arguments that are happening. And so they're pretty much all late date forgeries. Now, that's in juxtaposition to the later Orientalist view that does have a more positive attitude towards hadith. And there's developments happening currently on stuff like the Isnad Matan analysis and a couple other methodological means of validating hadith. But yeah, that is in stark contrast to the early Oriental view. And then the Muslim view is quite obvious that these sources do have historical reliability in them and that we can grade the reliability of those hadith given certain information, certain biographical information, and whatnot. And so again, Ross Rodgers is a separate kind of approach altogether. And although he is an Orientalist, he sets himself apart from all the other Orientalists and really responds to a lot of the Oriental works of the earlier scholars. So his approach and methodology is that he accepts the hadith regarding the military composition or political motives, and he accepts the general corpus, and that's because he uses empirical and logistical data to assess the internal consistency of those reports. So, the four main arguments that we'll be going over are essentially the reliability of the historical, military, and political narratives. And the idea here is that there are certain setbacks that seem embarrassing for Muslims, right? So, it's something that Muslims themselves would not really fabricate had they been given the opportunity to fabricate hadith. Those are not the kind of things that we would be expected to find. As well as the military records, they involve logistics and just the numbers seem to have this internal consistency within them. So we'll spend some time going over that as well. And like I said, there's certain individuals who are praised, certain people who don't we don't ought to find those kinds of praise of those individuals if they were really shaped by political conflicts, right? So we know that, for example, the Umayyad and the Abbasid dynasties were the first dynasties that kind of shaped a lot of the Muslim world in the beginning of Islam. And we have a lot of hostility. And the fact that we still find praise of individuals who don't belong in that camp goes to show that these are things that survived even despite political motivations. And lastly, again, there are stories that are just simply embarrassing for Muslims found within the Hadith corpus. And the fact that we have those preserved in the corpus today indicates the sincerity and the transparency of those early transmitters. Okay, so now With regards to an overview of the Orientalist critique of Hadith, we have individuals such as Goldsmith and Scott, and so what they argue is that the Hadith are pretty much late date political forgeries, and these forgeries are inspired and shaped by factions that have existed long after the Prophet passed away. And so they propose that the Islamic traditions developed over time into settled dogmas, which essentially cast doubt on these narrations wholesome. What's quite telling though is that Goldsmith still acknowledges that much of the source material does quite have factual information. So it's not necessarily a whole dismissal, but it's a means to dismiss the hadith as historical sources and any kind of approach, really. And so, what they inspired is this movement called the tradition critical approach, which again dismisses large portions of hadith as dogma that kind of formed much after the Prophet passed away. So that's in contrast to some of the more later developments amongst the Orientalists. So we have the views of Patricia Crona and Michael Cook, who advocate for an even more extreme approach. And this like radical skeptical approach started to claim that these hadith have absolutely no historical value whatsoever. And it's to put it in their own words, they said that it's quote unquote a historical junkyard. And so once again, that kind of shows this development that's happening even within the Orientalist works. Russ Rodgers, as we'll show in a bit, what he does is he elaborates on all of these Oriental works of old and essentially makes a robust case for the reliability of hadith. And to an extent, he sets the narrative as somewhat biased or selective reading amongst the Orientalists. So I think his work is quite seminal, it's quite interesting, and it's one that really shapes the rest of the Orientalist works to come. What is his stance? So what Rogers does is he adopts a uniquely like descriptive empirical approach that it, essentially accepts the Islamic sources of hadith at face value, and he only casts doubt on them when there is good reason to cast doubt on them, right? So what he's looking for are logistical corroborations within hadith. There's a famous quote by Rogers, and what he says is, quote, could these things happen in real space and time, end quote. And so the point again is that he's reading these hadith and he's trying to check whether or not it's even plausible that the information found in the hadith when it comes to like military expeditions, for example, like check out essentially. So for example, if sources say that a certain number of camels were used to transport supplies, could that number of camels realistically sustain the army's needs? These consistencies are a great way to kind of fact check a lot of the information found within hadith. And so he starts with these authentic hadith corpuses and goes through them individually and makes the case that they are pretty much, or the accounts match realistic expectations. And so that would be a significantly hard to fabricate if in fact these hadith were introduced and produced much later on in history. So a lot of the arguments that I'll be presenting, they are reliant upon this criteria called the criteria of embarrassment or dissimilarity. So the idea is that this is actually, it's been developed within biblical studies. It's been used within biblical studies for a while now, especially textual criticism. And what is that basically accounts or reports that run counter to a group's self-interest are less likely to be invented. So if something embarrassing or counterintuitive is reported, it's most likely true because there's no motive to necessarily fabricate that specific report. And like I said, what it's saying is that if there is this early report that survived that's based on an embarrassing fact about Muslims, then it's more likely to have gone back to the original Muhammad or the historical Muhammad as opposed to being later date fabrications. And like I said, that this criteria is used a lot in biblical studies. Bart Ehrman, who is really, he needs no introduction. He's well acknowledged in his own field, which is biblical criticism or textual criticism. He has this to say about the criteria of embarrassment. He says, The second criteria says that if there are stories about Jesus said or did that do not fit what the Christians have wanted to say about him, then those stories are more likely authentic than ones that could easily be imagined as something as a Christian would have wanted to make about him. This too is a good criteria, although it has limitations. But on the upside, if the stories are being changed in light of the Christian's self-interest in telling them, then anything that works against those self-interests found in the traditions are not stories the Christians have invented. So once again, going over the same principle of the criteria of embarrassment and showing how things that are counterintuitive to a group of people, if the mere fact that it survives shows that there is some historical value to that report. Now, with regards to the reliability of the historical, military, and political narratives, so Hadith and Sirah, they have within them many events that kind of they're quite embarrassing, right? And if people, specifically Muslims, had the audacity to remove or to change or to edit these hadith, they would have done so because these hadith, once again, are embarrassing. There's a motive to clean them up, essentially. So the historical narratives within both the hadith and seerah literature, which includes things like battles, alliances, conflicts, etc., these are deemed reliable because what they do is they preserve actual events rather than idealized legends. And so early Muslim historians are not simply whitewashing difficulties or oppositions or embarrassing setbacks. Instead, they are reliably pre presenting them as though they were authentic, as though they were valid historical sources of information. And so an interesting quote by Rodgers here is that he says, within the context of starting from the sources largely accepted as genuine within the Islamic movement, I depart from the approaches outlined by Donner by accepting the received collections of hadith literature, particularly regarding the military campaigns and operations. This naturally places my approach in contrast to the tradition critical approach, which sees much of the hadith literature as late date forgeries. The reason, and this part is important, right? It says the reason for my acceptance is both internal and based on the logistical analysis of the events. In this context, forgeries would not have been able to or would not have been able to match anecdotal recollections to the realities of the logistics involved. Besides the aforementioned logistics issue, there are concepts related within the early sources that imply authenticity. For example, why would the resistance in Mecca and even in Medina be highlighted rather than glossed over? Instances where Muslims were ambushed and defeated would have been glossed over or disappeared altogether. Now, this kind of goes over once again those setbacks and oppositions. So, there are a couple of things that we find in the hadith literature that honestly, if hadith were forged, these should not even be there. The first of which is the opposition in Mecca and Medina, right? So, early sources frankly describe how much Meccans resisted the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And even in Medina, some groups, such as the hypocrites, staunchly opposed and hesitated the conversion to Islam. And overall, this was a very embarrassing look on the Muslims. And so, again, this would have been glossed over or would have been removed. This element of this whole element of not accepting or having this jerk reaction against the message of Islam, that should have been glossed over by later historians had hadith been fabricated. So a fabricated saga would most likely like go right to a widespread community acceptance of Islam rather than going over all these minute tensions and hardships that were found within the hadith corpus. And so another example is the battles, right? So the Uhud and in the Badr battles, which once again have this flawed, embarrassing trope for the early Muslims. So at Badr, the Muslim force initially pretty much stumbled into enemy territory unknowingly. And again, this implies that the sources say that the Prophet himself was surprised by the Quraysh pretty much. And again, this is something that it shows the humanity of the Prophet, which is something that not many later date Muslims would be willing to accept. But despite that, these facts are preserved. Another example is Uhud, the Battle of Uhud, where the Muslims lost the battle and the Prophet himself was actually wounded. And that is a serious setback when it comes to the message of Islam. So a pious fabrication would have avoided or rewritten these details pretty much pretty much from the get-go, right? Uhud's loss would have become a victory. But again, we don't find that in the hadith literature. And so, if early Muslim historians were inventing tales to honor their faith, we would expect constant miracles and constant victories. But instead, we find in the narratives a mixed reality where we have exhaustion amongst the Muslim companions, amongst the Muslim armies. We even have occasional retreats where Muslims were losing the battles and they would retreat. And so, a good quote here is again Rodgers. He says, "If forged, Muhammad would have not been surprised at Badr, and Uhud would have been transformed into a victory." Once again, going over the whole narrative that's found within the Hadith corpus, that itself just seems unlikely to survive had Hadith been forged earlier on. Now, there are also the concept of kind of individuals within the Hadith corpus that should have been they should have been understood or portrayed in a different light had hadith been forged, right? And so what I mean by this is that the hadith in historical accounts, they don't necessarily omit the incidents that might tarnish the reputations of early Muslim individuals or early Muslim figures, right? So, for example, the Prophet's own uncle himself, Hadrat Abbas radiallahu anh, he's depicted in the Sirah literature as being a late convert to Islam. So he initially opposed the Prophet's message and was even captured as a pagan at the Battle of Badr. But later, some Muslims even complained that the Prophet showed extra leniency towards his own uncle, which again shows this whole concept of the humanity of the Prophet, questioning the Prophet's own gentleness. And once like again, what this shows is that this is quite an embarrassing thing to say about the Prophet, right? So why would this be something that was fabricated much later on in Islamic tradition? So such details they show or they show this kind of they portray this light of a late convert to Islam of these individuals as being embarrassing, and these features would have been removed from the hadith corpus much earlier on. Now, this also extends to after the Prophet himself as well. So, like early Islamic history candidly reports the political disputes that were happening after the Prophet's death. So, we already know the first fitna, for example, amongst the companions. So, for example, Tabari, he openly documents the first fitna, which includes the Battle of Jamal and Siffin, and he doesn't disguise any of the fights that were happening. So he openly portrays the conflict. He openly mentions how many people died in the fights and whatnot. And again, the idea here is that if historians were selectively choosing what to report and what not to report, we would not expect these quite embarrassing facts to have survived in our tradition. And again, this goes to show that the historians they weren't caring about how Islam looked in the eyes of people, but they were caring about reliably transmitting authentic narrations. And as a final example, we have also Allahu. So Muawiyah, who is a companion and he becomes the first Umayyad caliph, had hadith been forged, we'd expect that Muawiyah's reputation would be significantly tarnished or significantly praised, right? But what we find is really a mixed and a balanced account. We see that he was a scribe of the Prophet and he was also the governor of Syria, and yet we also see that he's very controversial in the fact that he challenges Ali's caliphate, right? So there's no historians are not shying away from this stuff. Historians are using this as prime examples, like Muslim historians like Ibn Kathir, they're openly portraying these conflicts and they're not removing any elements to them. They're not rewriting history essentially, despite the fact that there was good praise and also significantly bad aspects to the to these characters in the way that they've enacted certain political decisions. So once again, hadith been forged, we would actually not see this duality really. Now, what I'm going to be doing is going over specific case examples. And once again, these examples go to show that pretty much every single one of these events were quite embarrassing. So it makes no sense that Muslims would want to fabricate these events. So the first is the assassination of Ka'b ibn Ashraf. As a background, Ka'b ibn Ashraf was known to be a Jewish poet, and he was He resided in Badr, sorry, he resided in Medina, I believe it was. And what happens is that the Prophet kind of sanctions the assassination of Ka'b due to his treachery. And what we find in the Hadith corpus is actually quite interesting. So, what we find in the Hadith corpus is that three Muslims try to sneak up on Ka'b at night and they plot to assassinate him. But what ends up happening in the Hadith corpus is that they struggle significantly to the point where even one of the Muslims ends up stabbing his other Muslim partner. In other words, that Ka'b was he outsmarted the three Muslims. So just taking a step back, you can already see like the whole narrative is that it takes three Muslims just to put down one non-Muslim. Not only that, but even the three Muslims end up harming themselves and significantly making a mockery or a fool of themselves because they can't even kill one individual. And so something like this, the fact that it survives again goes to show that even though it's an embarrassing thing, historians are not shying away from it. Or transmitters are not shying away from it. Transmitters are still reporting these events, even though they make the Muslims look bad, right? So Rodgers here, he says something really interesting. He says the assassination plot against Ka'b ibn Ashraf would have gone smoothly with only one man killing him instead of three struggling to do so. So again, the fact that these individuals or the transmitters preserved this gritty reality, the fact that there are multiple attackers, it was a difficult fight, it shows that there, even though it's a mundane event, even though it's not necessarily an important event, yet the transmitters are being reliable, yet the transmitters are being faithful to the transmission of the text. They're not they're not fixing the messiness of the story. They're transmitting it exactly the way they heard it. Okay. Now, I've already touched this again, but just to go over it. So we have Abbas radiallahu an, who is the uncle of the Prophet himself. And he embraces Islam towards the end of the conquest of Mecca, which is about 630 CE. And so, despite being the progenitor of the late Abbasid caliphs, his early ambivalence is not whitewashed in the Islamic tradition. So that's quite an important point here because it's we know that the Abbasids ruled the Muslim empire, the Islamic empire for a number of years. It's quite easy, and the Abbasids loved traced their lineage to Abbas. So it would be in the Abbasids' favor to make Abbas as positive and as influential as they could. And yet, what we find in Hadith corpus is that Abbas, again, he dies earlier on, and he converts to Islam very late in life. And so we would actually find this as incredibly shocking if hadith were fabricated, because why would the Umayyads not, or sorry, why would the Abbasids not fabricate more narrations about Abbas or fabricate narrations that make him accept Islam from a much earlier date? So again, this goes to show that the whitewashing is not really there where we expect it to be. They also preserve anecdotes of Muslims voicing kind of objections against the Prophet himself, because there are narrations where the Prophet seems to imply some type of favoritism towards Abbas, and this is when Abbas was a pagan. And again, why would that stuff survive? Why, like, if transmitters were trying to fabricate narrations to spread the message of Islam, they would not want to portray Muhammad as having favorites in terms of who his family are and who aren't his family. It would be in the interest of the transmitters to portray Muhammad as this unbiased, God sent, non human, essentially, right? But what we see again is the opposite. Now, moving on, what we're going to be looking at is the logistics behind these military reports and showing how these reports have this layer of internal consistency that really make it stand out. And so what I mean by that is that certain hadith, they detail specific notions about the military records, right? So they detail things like the size of the troops, the animals that were used, the what rations were available, the distances between the battle zones, like how far they would have to walk, how much water they would have to live off of, and just stuff like that. There's the hadith corpus is filled with examples like this. And Rodgers, he what he says here is that he says forgeries would not have matched anecdotal recollections to actual logistics. And he says, within the context of starting from the sources largely accepted as genuine within the Islamic movement, the reason for my acceptance is both internal and based on the logistical analysis of the events. In this context, forgeries would not have been able to match anecdotal recollections to realities of the logistics involved. So this suggests that the narrations stem from this genuine approach or genuine attempt to recollect and transmit these reports. And it would be highly unlikely that later fabricators are able to get these mundane features right about battle, about troop sizes, about animal resources, about rations. And like I said, I believe Rodgers also has another quote where he says by examining whether reported troop movements and provisions could have happened in real time and space. So again, he reads these narrations and he questions whether or not it's even plausible, right? Not just possible, but plausible that uh, these logistics make sense internally. And I think, yeah, that's an incredible testimony for the reliability of these hadith. So, what is his specific methodology? So, what Rodgers does is he cross-checks the anecdotal reports against the laws of logistics. So, for instance, if a hadith has 300 fighters and 70 camels that, set out for a month-long expedition, he asks, did they have enough mounts, water, and food to cover that duration? If sources note the provisions were low, do we have the army experiencing hunger or needing resupply at the expected time? And so I hope that you understand what he's trying to say here. So Rogers is he's finding these mundane aspects within the hadith that are not that obvious when you first read them, and he's looking for internal consistencies throughout. And he finds that the hadith narratives often align with feasible rates of travel, hunger periods, and resupply points. And a random kind of invention would likely err in these specific examples. So just a particular example, right? He gives the example of camels and supplies. So he says, if the early sources indicate that so many camels were used to transport, could these camels carry sufficient resources to keep an army supplied in the field? And in many cases, the answer is yes. The rations, travel speed, and terrain challenges or train challenges mentioned in Hadith align with what the number of camels or provisions would realistically allow. So once again, he's bringing his own expertise in the field, and he is looking at the multiple factors, the multifactorial aspects of the time period, and as well as the terrain and kind of the logistics. And he's noting that there's this clear logistical consistency found within the hadith that once again would be very difficult to fabricate by later scribes or later transmitters. So this is a point where we can really skip on, but one of the contentions is that how is it possible that the early Muslim expansion grew so much in such a short period of time? And so what Rogers does is he compares it to Alexander the Great, and he kind of shows the Orientalists who are questioning this. Look, you guys accept the rapid conquest of Alexander the Great, but for some reason, when it comes to Muslim conquests within a similar time frame, for some reason you guys are being inconsistent in rejecting that. But regardless, there's also other works that are done on this that show that this early expansion type mindset was actually quite common in early Muslim Arabia. Wrapping up on this section, the idea behind the logistics reliability is that the campaigns of the Prophet that are recorded in Hadith, such as the Battle of Badr, of Khaybar, of Tabuk, they exhibit logistic details that match known physical constraints. For example, distance between wells on the routes to Badr, they correspond with reports on, for example, when the army became dehydrated. At the Battle of Khandaq, the number of kind of laborers and the length of the trench align with how long excavation took in these reports. So these small details strengthen the overall case that the narratives are based on real memories and documents, not just late date forgeries. And like I said, it would have been extraordinarily difficult for storytellers or fabricators who are writing decades to centuries after these events to invent fake numbers and scenarios that constantly hold up under logistical scrutiny. And so Rogers, he says forgeries would not have been able to match anecdotal recollections to realities of the logistics involved. So the fact that the hadith accounts do withstand this logistical cross-check suggests that they are drawn from authentic experiences are of the actual participants themselves, not just propagandists. And Rodgers concludes and he says that because the internal evidence, so for example, the coherence of time, the place, and the numbers, it supports the narrative. He accepts the hadith when it comes to the military operations as fundamentally reliable. There's no real reason to negate those specific hadith in terms of authenticity. Now, moving on to the next section, we have praises of individuals within the kind of the canonical hadith corpus that once again we don't necessarily expect to find had they been fabricated, right? So numerous authentic hadith lavish praise on Quran as well as the Ahlul Bayt, and these narrations survived despite the politically charged environment of kind of what ends up happening afterwards, right? So we have, for example, the Umayyads and the Abbasids, and we know that hadith transmission, or at least the Abbasids, or sorry, at least within the Umayyads, there was this kind of large scale silencing of praises of Ali and the Ahlul Bayt because they belonged to the Abbasid dynasty. So because the Umayyads were in opposition to the Umayyads did not like praise of the Abbasids. But despite that, we find that the transmitters of hadith, they really didn't care about that. They didn't care even though there was incentive of imprisonment, even though there was this fear of coming into oppression from the Umayyad caliphs, despite that, we still find transmitters reporting praise of the Abbasid individuals such as Ali alayhi salam and the Ahl Bayt. And the fact that these hadiths survive in our books imply that the Umayyads really couldn't, even if they tried, they couldn't silence this voice that was occurring. They couldn't really silence this hostility or the writing down of these hadith, and they really couldn't remove these hadith altogether from the hadith corpus. And that's why they've survived today. So for more like kind of historical context, after the Prophet passes, we have the whole like Shia Sunni split. And so the Umayyad dynasty, which starts with Muawiyah, we see that there is this marginalizing of the memory of Ali, right? And so once again, all of this goes to show that the transmitters didn't really care about the political situation. They viewed the entire thing as a duty to preserve the religious authenticity or the historical authenticity of these reports. Like I said here, we have this whole political tension that's occurring amongst the Umayyads, and we'd expect to find more silencing of the Abbasid kind of characters as well as Ali alayhi salam, but we find the exact opposite, right? So what we find is virtues about Ali, we find his leadership at Khaybar, his closeness to the Prophet, as well as extensive praise for Hassan and Hussein alayhi salam as being the grandsons of the Prophet. And once again, like this goes to show that doesn't matter who you think you are in terms of the political, like in terms of your authority in the political kind of atmosphere. The hadith transmitters are trying to be as reluctant, and they're trying to preserve as much detail as they could, despite them coming into political tension with the caliphs themselves. So, just for specific examples, we have multiple praises found within Sunni hadith books. For example, Bukhari, Muslim, that include numerous traditions highlighting the merit of Ali. For example, the Prophet ﷺ famously declared at Khaybar, he says, "Tomorrow I will give the banner to a man who loves Allah and His Messenger." And then he handed it to Ali, signaling Ali's piety, essentially. And there's other narrations that call Ali the Prophet's brother, for example, and they also call him the one who possesses knowledge. So, for example, he says the Prophet ﷺ says, "I am the city." Sorry, he says, "I am the city of knowledge, and Ali is the gate." Right, so this is reported in, or for example, Ali as alayhi salam, the Prophet ﷺ says, I'm forgetting this last one, but there's essentially a number of hadith narrations within the hadith corpus that go over the praise of Ali alayhi salam. Again, this is highly unlikely given that the Umayyads discouraged public praise of Ali. In fact, some Umayyad officials even they openly cursed Ali, right, within sermons. So Yet what we find is pious transmitters of hadith, they don't eliminate traditions like this. They continuously elevate his status, even though there is this whole political tension occurring. And even though that they're coming in the crossfire, they're still willing to excessively advocate these praises for Ali. And so this goes to show there's no really like whitewashing or erasing these motivations or these narratives because really it was a really robust tradition. It was not something that people, it was something that people were willing to die for, and it's something that we just had they been tampered with, we would see physical evidence of that, and yet we don't see that. Continuing on. Now, what we find is we see a balanced approach within the Hadith corpus, right? So when it comes to the dynasties that were involved, each dynasty, both the Umayyads and the Abbasids had their own political interest in mind, right? So we don't see a one-sided narrative. It's not as if there is no praise for Ali or total erasure of Abbas. And it's what we see instead is both praising of Ali and acknowledging Abbas's role. And so one of the things that kind of Rodgers comments on, he says about the Abbas narratives, he says that one might argue that some hadith were forged to promote the Abbasid family. But what he says is, he says nothing, sorry, he says that the traditions about Abbas were probably well established in the corpus of early Islamic oral tradition long before the rise of the Abbasid dynasty, right? And again, he's saying that these praises happened before these dynasties even emerged. And there's a number of other kind of things that are involved. For example, the sympathies that the Shia had for Ali, we see excessive praise, and we actually do notice some hadith that do have excessive praise within them. But the idea here is that there is this uniform, balanced approach that is motivated by a genuine desire of tracing authentic reports. And there's not just this uniform, it's not just a rewriting of history, essentially. Now, in this last section, we'll be going over stories that seem embarrassing for Muslims. And once again, had these stories truly been fabricated, then we would not even expect them to be found within the Hadith corpus today. So these Muslims preserved incidents that honestly could easily be weaponized. And they show that the transmitters were trying to be as committed to the truth as they could. So early Muslim historians and Hadith scholars, they don't shy away from recording these kinds of episodes. And even though it portrays them as unfavorable or it embarrasses these Muslim communities, they're still sincere and I mean, they relay the information as honestly as they could. Yeah, again, that goes to show that these stories themselves have some kind of historical value associated to them. So the first of these examples is the Uthmanic kind of Quran and the disputes that happened with the Uthmanic Quran. As a background, what ends up happening is that Uthman, he undergoes the standardization of the Quran by compiling an official mushaf. And but what ends up happening is that he's confronted by Ibn Mas'ud, and Ibn Mas'ud, he has his own personal copy and he disagrees with, first of all, he disagrees with being excluded from the committee itself, right? So he felt his own Quran recitation, his Quranic recitation copies were being set aside in favor of Zayd bin Thabit's work. And that's something that kind of this conflict shows this, it casts doubt on the entire standardization process altogether. So why would a Muslim fabricate such a story, right? Why would a Muslim go ahead and at the expense of downplaying the role of the Quranic preservation, why would they fabricate these stories? So again, this is something that's extremely embarrassing for Muslims. Now, despite that, this narrative is also found in multiple authentic hadith reports with very strong chains, right? So I've written here, it's found via Zuhri, via Ibn Utbah, and we have multiple narrations of these events that come through robust chains. So again, like this is not some like pious cover up, right? It's not as if there's this whitewashing that's happening. Because if there were, we would 100% expect these not to survive. Not only are they not only are they in our hadith books, but they're actually graded rigorously authentic, right? That's something that a Muslim would never want to really truly admit. And so then the second example is that of the Prophet and his farming advice. So what happens here is that there's a famous incident where the Prophet gives an offhand suggestion about date palm cultivation. So there were a number of Sahabi who were gardening their date palm trees, and they were trying to pollinate artificially to allow for more pollination, for more ripening of their dates. And so the Prophet ﷺ, more or less, he sees this and what he basically gives them some advice, right? He says, more or less, he's like, don't do it this way, but do it this way. Now, what ends up happening is that a couple of months go by, and when they harvest, it turns out that they actually harvest in a very poor quality, right? They actually weren't, the dates themselves weren't as ripe, they weren't fresh. And so the Prophet learns of this and he goes to them and he says to them, you are more knowledgeable in the affairs of your world, i.e., farming, right? What this is implying is that his advice that like when it comes to agriculture, he was implying that it's not really binding on the ummah, right? It's just his own personal opinion. So in essence, he acknowledged a mistake and he clarified that this is coming from me and I'm like more than me when it comes to these worldly affairs, right? So that's quite embarrassing, right? Because that shows the Prophet's human character. That shows that he could be wrong when it comes to these mundane things, right? And yet, this is not only preserved, but it's preserved with rigorously authentic chains, right? It's preserved by multiple chains of transmission, and it's something that had there been wide scale like propaganda or wide scale whitewashing, something like this would never have survived. Now, as a last example, we have the satanic verses. So, what is the satanic verses, right? The background is quite long, but we know that there was this narration that's reported by Ibn Ishaq and some other narrators where the Prophet is supposedly he was tricked by the devil into revealing specific verses in the Quran. And this is obviously quite embarrassing. It's controversial, right? It's because if we say that the devil can have an influence into revelation, then really how do we trust anything else in the book, right? How come, why do we not just throw our hands up and say the entire Quran is satanic, pretty much, right? What's interesting here is that we have so this hadith is not authentic. No one takes it authentically, right? It's actually well known to be weak and fabricated. But despite it being weak and fabricated, once again, Muslim scholars didn't like completely erase this hadith. It's not as if they removed this hadith completely. In fact, they bring the hadith and they do widespread analysis of the text of the hadith as well as the isnad of the hadith, right? And then they're completely transparent. They show that there are issues with the isnad, there are issues with the chain of transmitters, there's issue with the text, right? And they're very open about it. And what here again, if these hadith, if there was a motivation to clear these hadith up, to clean them up and remove them, they wouldn't have survived. And yet they do. And just as a summary, to conclude this entire presentation, what we find is that we have the Orientalist claim that early Islamic hadiths and these sources, they're largely invented by later people who are undergoing these political motivations. And so they're trying to justify their own, the way that they rule a specific region, or they're trying to win an argument. So they would fabricate these hadith. But what we saw is that although biases are necessary, like although biases are always going to be there, and there are going to be people who are going to fabricate hadith, we see actually that there's a balanced view, right? It's multifaceted. It's not as if there's only one side of the argument. We see a mixed attitude towards these individuals. It's not completely whitewashed in that sense. And then another claim is that the oral tradition transmission is unreliable, and that these hadith are built by upon legends that kind of evolve over decades. And what we saw is that oral traditions can be remarkably reliable, especially when it comes to a community that's known for memorizing, right? So, like the Arabs were known for their rigor when it comes to the use of isnads and the way of memorizing poetry and Quran. And so they were known to memorize these narrations. Now, we also saw that there's this whole kind of Muslim conspiracy that they're trying to destroy opposing records, but we don't find that once again. So we find actually multiple narrations where Muslims are actually embarrassed, right? There's multiple stories where Muslims are embarrassed, the assassination of Ka'b, the defeat at Uhud, right? And once again, we would expect these things to have been removed. Hadith where had these have hadith been fabricated. And now one last thing to know is that yes, so although there were hadith fabrications, what we have to realize is that the Muslims themselves are the ones who are admitting that they are fabrications, right? The Muslims themselves are admitting, look, there are multiple fabricated hadith that are out there. And so this is acknowledged by the Muslim scholars themselves. And what they're doing is that they themselves are the ones who are catching the fabricators, right? The Muslims are the ones who have implemented this rigorous methodology of isnad, like authentication, where they are rigorously attacking these transmitters and integrating the chains in a way that makes it confident or makes one confident in their ability to accept these hadith. So yeah, I think that should be an end to this conclusion to this part. And in the next episode, we will go over some of the other chains and pretty much arguments that go over the isnads and why the isnad system is reliable.